U.S. justice officials reveal they've never had any evidence that bringing criminal charges against financial institutions would harm the economy. So why have banks escaped prosecution? Plus, more than a month after the Venezuelan elections, why does the U.S. still refuse to recognize Nicolas Maduro as the elected president? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. Despite extensive investigations into the conduct of major financial institutions by the U.S. government since the 2008 financial crisis, no criminal charges have been filed. Statements by key justice officials have strongly suggested that a major factor in their decision not to prosecute is their fear of a negative impact on the economy. Here's how former Assistant Attorney General Lanny Breuer put it during a speech to the New York Bar Association.
I personally feel that it's my duty to consider whether individual employees with no responsibility for or knowledge of misconduct committed by others in the same company are going to lose their livelihood if we indict the corporation.
And those sentiments were echoed by the Attorney General, Eric Holder, when he spoke to Congress in March of this year.
I am concerned that the size of some of these institutions becomes so large that it does become difficult for us to prosecute them when we are hit with indications that if you do prosecute, if you do bring a criminal charge, it will have a negative impact on the national economy, perhaps even the world economy. And I think that is a function of the fact that some of these institutions have become too large.
He has since backtracked somewhat on that statement. And on Wednesday, a senior justice official testifying before the House Financial Services Committee revealed that, in fact, the department had no evidence that such a prosecution would harm the economy, nor was any research sought to gauge any potential negative consequences. So what's behind the Department of Justice's reluctance to act? And joining me now is Russel Mokhiber. He's the editor of Corporate Crime Reporter. And Bartlett Naylor. He's a financial policy advocate at Public Citizen and the former chief of investigations for the U.S. Senate Banking Committee. There is still this question, then, of why there have been no criminal prosecutions as a result of the financial crisis. And beyond that, even when a HSBC is found to be laundering money for Mexican drug cartels, or UBS is found to be manipulating interest rates, no one's going to court, let alone to jail. Russell, to what extent do you think this fear of collateral consequences to the economy may have something to do with that?
In the minds of people going through the revolving door from government to the defense law firms and so forth, it has a lot to do with it. But it's interesting, we had a conference at the National Press Club on exactly this issue earlier this month, and we had prosecutors, we had the top Justice Department prosecutors, we had defense attorneys, we had academics, we had public interest types like Bart. And how did it break down? The people going through the revolving door, the prosecutors and the corporate crime defense attorneys, said, we need to look at the collateral consequences. We can't force guilty pleas. We have to stick by neither admit nor deny. We can't force admissions. The academics, the public interest types, most of the reporters, they understood what was going on, that this was a special deal, that we have a two-tier justice system, one for big corporations and one for individuals. So the answer to why is this happening? The revolving door money. Lanny Breuer, former head of the criminal division, charged with prosecuting these banks, didn't do it. Now at Covington, making $4 million a year to defend these banks.
I mean, there is the other explanation, which is often hinted at by the Attorney General and others, and that is that there is not enough evidence beyond a reasonable doubt to bring a prosecution.
But not in the case of HSBC, where the 30-page statement of facts said HSBC admits to criminal violations involving $200 trillion worth of money laundering transactions, which, if this were brought to trial, and I am quoting, we would prove beyond a reasonable doubt.
All right, well, then let's look at the testimony that we heard from E Rahman, the acting Assistant Attorney General of the Criminal Division for the U.S. Department of Justice before the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations on Financial Services. She had a number of interesting points, and one of them is that the U.S. Attorney's Manual requires federal prosecutors to consider collateral consequences, specifically the potentially adverse impact a prosecution may have on investors, pension holders, customers, employees, and the public, including on innocent people who had nothing to do with criminal conduct. And she added that this has been required since 2008 in the manual. There had been memos since 1999, although she did stress that none of this was an impediment to seeking criminal penalties. No one was immune from prosecution. But this is what they have to do.
Right, but also during that same hearing, she said, we never consider collateral consequences when it comes to individuals. Thus, once again, redefining our equal justice under law as a two-tier criminal justice system. So, for example, let's say an individual gets involved with a minor drug deal. They're forced to plead guilty, and let's say they just get probation. What are the collateral consequences? Lose your driver's license, no public benefits, can't get a job right across the board, and the prosecutors can't consider that. But when it comes to a large multinational corporation, you have to look at so-called innocent shareholders. And the question is, are they truly innocent? They benefit from the criminal wrongdoing. Why shouldn't they pay the price?
Well, and there's this other issue then, though. If they are considering collateral consequences, how much consideration is going into that deliberation? And E Rahman said that we consult widely with experts outside the Justice Department, that is, with relevant domestic and foreign regulators, and so on and so forth. And yet, it seems that maybe they aren't really doing that at all.
No, Public Citizen FOIA'd the documents.
Freedom of Information Act.
Freedom of Information Act. So this is internal data that I have in front of me, or internal emails and memoranda. And one thing that's clear is what's missing, namely any sober, rigorous analysis of the possibility that they would seek a criminal indictment of the company itself. Instead, what one sees is spin. One sees unhappiness with a state lawmaker or a state regulator in this case who was taking sterner action with HSBC.
But what are we to make of that? Is that then because, frankly, it isn't unreasonable to expect there to be some financial consequences of going after a large bank, or is it simply that there's just no intention of going after these large corporations because there's a deal?
Russell and I might disagree. I think Attorney General Eric Holder was accurate when he said that we could not bring the full suite of penalties versus this bank because it was too large. There is an answer to that. We can't afford to have banks that are this large. But I think that truly reflected, he was being candid, that truly reflected what was going on in Justice's mind when they elected not to indict the bank.
But Russell, do you have any evidence that there's some sort of top-down policy not to jail bankers or any corporations, frankly? Or is this simply maybe a well-meaning but unsubstantiated fear about the specific consequences on the economy?
Well, the evidence is in the cases that the Justice Department has brought. When we started our publication 20 years ago, the Justice Department, when it had evidence of criminal wrongdoing, and it does have evidence for all these cases. One of the things E Rahman said yesterday was, in all of these deferred non-prosecution agreements, we force the companies to acknowledge their criminal wrongdoing, and they do. There's these long statement of facts. But 20 years ago, the Justice Department would bring a case, force a guilty plea, or not bring a case. And that pattern has shifted now so that the vast majority of these cases are settled with deferred and non-prosecution agreements. So that's the evidence. It's a fundamental shift in practice. The SEC obviously does a very similar thing when, even for recidivist companies like Citibank, they've been before the SEC 5 times in the last 10 years, and they enter into these deferred, neither admit nor deny consent decrees, where they say, we neither admit nor deny violating the law, but we promise not to do it again. And then they do it again, and they get another neither admit nor deny consent decree. So we had a former head of the environmental crime section, David Ullman, at our conference. He's now a professor. He's not in the revolving door. He didn't go into the law firm. He went to the University of Michigan Law School. And he says there's no reason for this practice. We should go back to forcing criminal guilty pleas. They do it at they still do it at the Environmental Crimes Unit. They do it at the Antitrust Division. They just don't do it where it counts, at the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice.
And clearly this is because of the amount of influence these banks and financial institutions have in Washington. In fact, this morning you mentioned Citi. We hear that Citigroup is in fact helping draft, word for word, the regulation on certain trading activities. So is this then...
Well, you're overstating it. It was 75 lines out of the 80 lines.
I'm sorry, yes.
Which came from Citicorp. Yeah. And as we know, the Treasury Secretary came to the government from Citicorp, where he had a bonus for basically $1 million a year conditioned on him either staying at Citicorp or finding a high-level job. We have, just to put color on Russell's comment that we have a revolving door, we have government sacks. We have the very people working for Wall Street doing their public service for 2 or 3 years in very senior positions. And then
is this
going
corruption
back
necessarily, or just a shared economic vision, so a shared philosophy of how society works
well,
and functions?
Wall Street,
perhaps?
we should never put the sheriff's badge on people representing Wall Street. And that's what we're doing. Mary Jo White, head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, came out of a big corporate law firm representing big corporations before the Justice Department and the SEC, and now she's got the sheriff's badge on. I don't think we should do that. We should put the sheriff's badge on somebody not from Wall Street.
All right, so what happened to all the regulation we were hearing about, and where are we on all of that? And as you say, the one way to avoid this is not to have banks that are too big to fail in the first place. So where are we on that?
Dodd-Frank is 30% implemented. The tough part of the rules remain unimplemented. That's the activity restriction in the Volcker rule, the thing that keeps banks from gambling. We have this promise of a so-called orderly liquidation. We won't know if that's implemented until the first test. God forbid that should happen. But what is clear, there's emerging consensus, I believe, that Dodd-Frank has not gone far enough, that we need bold new measures. The front runner today is to require banks to have roughly 3 times as much equity investment that is at risk instead of credit at risk. The shorthand for that is Brown-Vitter. It's got a couple of co-sponsors in the Senate.
And Russell, 10 seconds. Are you confident that we will finally get reform, though?
I'm not confident at all, but my reform would be to somehow slam the revolving door shut so that people wouldn't be going back and forth all the time.
Russel Mokhiber, thank you very much. Bartlett Naylor, thank you as well.
Thank you.
It's been more than a month since Nicolas Maduro won the Venezuelan elections, and the United States has yet to recognize him as president of the country. Maduro won by a narrow margin in April, a victory that is being contested by the opposition candidate Enrique Capriles. Every country in Latin America, though, has recognized the election result. And critics are asking whether the U.S. position is designed to encourage the opposition to continue its challenge. It's the latest sign of Washington's poor relationship with Venezuela's current and former government, a relationship that some contend colors the reporting of Venezuelan politics in the U.S. media. More than 1,000 people, including leading U.S. intellectuals and filmmakers, have signed a petition calling on the New York Times to investigate its reporting on Venezuela for bias, specifically the repeated characterization of the late Hugo Chavez as a dictator. It notes that those governments in the region who do subvert democracy but are aligned with U.S. policy are rarely questioned in the press. Earlier this week, I spoke to one of the signatories of the petition, filmmaker Oliver Stone, and asked him what he's hoping this petition will accomplish.
Awareness. What else can you do? The New York Times has been one of the chief offenders when it comes to Latin American affairs. I've been reading them for 10 years now because I've been interested in Cuba, Venezuela, and the shift in the continent to the left, and it has been badly covered, and inconsistent and double standards, from the election in Mexico to the coup in Honduras to numerous instances of violence in Colombia and Mexico against reformers. It's been ignored, and the blame has been brought by the Times and much of the Western media against those people who have challenged the United States foreign policy in Latin America, among them, of course, Venezuela.
But in some of your other work, you've explored how the entire presentation of U.S. history, of U.S. empire, is routinely misrepresented in our schools and elsewhere. Do you think this is all then connected to that? Does there need to be a conspiracy necessarily, or is it just programmed into perhaps the sort of the journalists and those who are doing the work on the New York Times and on other outlets too?
There's no conspiracy in that sense, no, but it's a programmed mindset. You can go back and I mean, this is a much longer discussion and a good one, by the way, but you should please take a look at our untold history where we go back into the 1900s to understand why the media is always backing this expansionism and militarism of the U.S. Now, that's not to say that the New York Times and so forth are not critical of the militarism. They are, and have been in many ways. They've been critical finally about the Vietnam War, finally about the Iraq War, but not at the beginning. So unfortunately, we learn late, and we don't really learn, I don't think. This policy, you know, for example, Obama came into office in 2008. We had great hopes. And one of the first significant things that happened was the coup in Honduras. So many of us who have studied Latin affairs were so disappointed by his negligence in this matter. After shaking the hand of Chavez down at the conference there, he did nothing to reverse the coup in Honduras against Zelaya, who was removed by, you know, the usual corrupt bunch of military people and politicos in Honduras who had been American, U.S. allies in that region since way back, going back to the 1980s. I was in Honduras when I made Salvador, and I saw, you know, the U.S. troops were in Honduras. It was known as a hotbed of rebellion, but again, torture, espionage. U.S. interests were all over the region trying to destabilize the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and the FMLN in Salvador. They were helping the Guatemalans. Honduras was a bad place, and it hasn't changed. Zelaya was cleaning up the place. Finally, was taking part in that leftward movements that had been so effective in cleaning up the corruption of Latin America. And he was one of those people, and he was removed by the same cabal. And Obama did nothing at all. He made the usual.
Why he decided just to carry on the hostility of the previous administration and instead of trying to
we were all surprised. Obama let us down. But again, on a broad scale across the world, Obama certainly declared, you know, showed his true colors in other regions of the world. But certainly the Honduran incident was one of the first. You know, since these thugs took over, they had an election shortly thereafter, and that election, you know, was legitimized by the United States, but it is really a dirty election, as was the Mexican elections and so many elections in Latin America. Unlike the Venezuelan elections, which have been deemed by many international bodies as perhaps the cleanest elections in the world. That's what Jimmy Carter called them.
And joining me now from New York is Gregory Wilpert, editor of VenezuelaAnalysis.com, and he's also one of the signatories of this petition. And here in the studio, Keen Butt, a media accountability activist focusing on the U.S. media's portrayal of Latin America. He helped draft the petition. We also invited the New York Times public editor, Margaret Sullivan, but she declined. Actually, in fact, Keen Butt, have you had any response from the New York Times yet?
There's been no official response thus far.
All right, well then let's go into this petition in a bit more detail. What exactly are you alleging? What specific examples can you produce to suggest some sort of bias in the New York Times?
So what we did was we looked over 4 years of coverage of the New York Times, starting on June 28th, 2009. The reason why we selected that date is because it's the date in which a military coup d'etat overthrew a democratically elected left-leaning president, Manuel Zelaya. And since that point onward, there's been 2 post-coup governments, both with exceeding levels of illegitimacy. The first came in power through a coup, and the second came in power through repressive sham elections held under that coup government. In the meantime, you've had those past 4 years in which you've had a number of elections or referenda take place, and international monitors have regarded all of those executions of elections as free and fair. Nevertheless, what you find is 16 separate instances in which the New York Times refers to President Hugo Chavez as either an autocrat, a dictator, an authoritarian, a strongman, a caudillo, etc., and so on. So you have all of these epithets being hurled at a leader who came to power in elections which were hailed by President Jimmy Carter, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, as the best elections in the world. And at the same time, you have 2 repressive governments whose security forces have a record of routinely killing civilians, something that Venezuela does not share. And yet none of these 4 years have ever found a single instance in which the New York Times used any of those same epithets towards these post-coup leaders in Honduras.
Right, exactly. So that's the key then. So you're comparing it to their coverage of Honduras, which is a country which has had a great deal of political upheaval, but which the U.S. has primarily supported, or they've primarily supported the governments who have been alleged to be doing the repression.
Right. We've indicated that this tracks very, very closely with U.S. foreign policy interests. Right. So you have about $60 million a year going to the repressive state security forces of Honduras.
Gregory Wilpert, though, I mean, clearly the New York Times, I mean, there are examples of the New York Times doing this then, according to Keane, so we can all see. But it's not just the New York Times, is it? I mean, it's wire agencies and TV programs and TV stations. They also repeat these formulations of firebrand strongmen when it comes to certain governments and yet don't for others.
Yes, you certainly see it in practically all of the corporate media in the United States, or even in English-speaking media also in Britain. By and large, it's the same type of coverage across the board, and the same kind of disparity when it comes to, if you just compare Venezuela and Honduras, for example.
Right, but I mean, there's always that question of what's behind it, and that's a more complicated question, I guess, as to whether this is conscious or unconscious. Keane, I mean, do you and those who've signed the petition have any sense of that? I mean, how much effort goes into this sort of misrepresentation, or is it why journalists think it's acceptable to call a democratically elected government, or leader a dictator and not to others? I mean, is there any clue up to all that?
The petition itself has a very narrow focus, which is to ask the public editor to investigate that very question. I personally think that the New York Times, while being deemed an independent watchdog news agency, is quite often very much in conformity with U.S. state foreign policy imperatives and prerogatives. And so this is a tendency that's been repeated over and over and repeatedly uncovered over and over, that you have official enemies and they're regarded in one standard, and then you have others that do not accommodate U.S. foreign policy interests.
And that's the point. I mean, there's this wider issue that this isn't limited to Latin America, but it's a global issue, really.
It's a global issue, and it really does call into question the very independence of our supposedly independent press.
Gregory Wilpert, I mean, I know you, and on your website, you have many critiques of media representation of Venezuela. Something that often seems to be lacking in a lot of the coverage is any kind of historical context. What preceded Chavez? The corruption, the brutality, the crackdowns on students and others, the poverty, really. And do you think that's part of the problem, that journalists perhaps don't do the homework, so it's very easy for them to be swayed by official U.S. narratives?
Yes, absolutely. That's definitely one of the main causes, is the lack of context. But I also want to add something else, which is, journalists often come to a country such as Venezuela or other countries in Latin America, usually on with a 1 or 2 year commitment, and so they oftentimes don't have that broader context when they arrive there. But not only that, they end up living and socializing with the other journalists who are already there, who, in the case of Venezuela, for example, are very much affiliated with the opposition. That is, the private media is very much affiliated with the opposition already, and basically enter their worldview. I mean, I noticed this over and over again. When the journalist first arrives in Venezuela, they have, I think, a much more open, actually, perception of what's going on in Venezuela. But after a couple of years, it's more and more tainted by the opposition viewpoint, and I think it comes from the socialization. And then, of course, there's the structural kind of background that a journalist who's from the start, let's say, more sympathetic to the Chavez government would never have a chance to get ahead in a major corporation such as the New York Times or the other major media in the United States.
And I guess there's another issue there, whether English-speaking journalists are simply talking to English-speaking commentators in Venezuela who perhaps might be less inclined to Chavez. Let's bring this up to date, though, with U.S. foreign policy and how then that might, in the future, help define the coverage in the New York Times of Venezuela. Is the U.S. going to recognize the Venezuelan government? They still haven't yet. Is there any indication that they will?
So far, I haven't seen any movement in that direction, although the Venezuelan government has repeatedly said that it's interested in improving relations with the United States, and I would assume that one precondition, of course, for such improved relations would be the recognition of the government. So, in a way, it's really the U.S. government that's once again standing in the way of improved relations between the United States and Venezuela.
Very quickly, is it clear what the Obama administration is trying to achieve by not recognizing the government?
Yes, I think it's basically trying to encourage the opposition to challenge and to keep the level of tensions in Venezuela high, in the hopes that Maduro would leave office sooner rather than later.
All right, Greg Wilpert, thank you very much. We did ask for the State Department to join in on this discussion, but they declined. Keane Butt, thank you very much as well.
Thanks for having me.
And that's it from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.